From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Psychiatry Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinions featured in JAMA Psychiatry.
Welcome to the JAMA Psychiatry Author Interview Podcast. I'm your host and web editor, Dr. John Torous. Today, we're thrilled to be discussing a new paper just out in JAMA Psychiatry on adolescent psychedelic use and psychotic or manic symptoms. We're about to be joined by the first and corresponding author of the paper, Dr. Otto Simonsson, PhD, from the Department of Neurobiology, Care Science and Society at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. Psychedelic drug use is a topic often in the news, and today in the United States, the FDA is actively reviewing data from clinical studies. While the future of legalization is hard to predict, looking back at history and debates on the legalization of, say, medical marijuana, it is clear that today psychedelics are the new frontier for legalization efforts. While concern about the impact of marijuana in youth, especially in psychosis, was likely fully not explored before legalization efforts took hold there, now is the exact right time to ensure those efforts are done for psychedelics. But what do we even know about how these drugs may impact youth around psychotic or manic symptoms? To find out, we will explore the results of this brand new study just out in JAMA Psychiatry and discuss with the first author, Dr. Simonsson. So, Dr. Simonsson, thank you so much for joining us, and let's jump right in. Psychedelic drugs are a broad term. What is commonly meant by them, and what drugs are often included in this category?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And with regards to your question, let's perhaps begin with a little bit of a history lesson.
Great.
So the term psychedelic was first coined by the British psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond in a letter exchange with Aldous Huxley, who was a famous British writer and philosopher. And in one of his letters, Osmond wrote a beautiful poem and proposed that drugs such as mescaline and LSD ought to be called psychedelic, which was a word with Greek roots that essentially meant mind-revealing. Having said that, that doesn't mean that all drugs that are mind-revealing in some sense are included in the definition of psychedelic drugs. In fact, there are quite a few differing opinions in the scientific community, but often when scientists talk about psychedelics, they are typically referring to so-called classic psychedelics, which are a group of psychoactive drugs that primarily act as agonists or partial agonists at serotonin 2A receptors in the brain. This group of drug typically includes mescaline and LSD, but it also includes psilocybin, which is the primary psychoactive ingredient in so-called magic mushrooms, as well as DMT, which is one of the primary psychoactive ingredients in ayahuasca.
That's a nice history lesson and a very good direct answer of what we're considering. And in the paper, you and your team note that guidelines on psychedelic research recommend that individuals with a personal or family history of psychotic or bipolar disorder should often be excluded from clinical trials. Why is this so, and what is the reason for that exclusion recommendation?
Yeah, so these exclusion criteria are primarily driven by safety concerns. Individuals with a personal or family history of psychotic or bipolar disorders are thought to be at higher risk of unwanted effects of psychedelics, such as potentially triggering or exacerbating psychotic or manic episodes. Now, these are very reasonable concerns, but so far these concerns have not been based on an overwhelming body of evidence. And so that's why it's so important that we do further research to get a more robust understanding of risks and also potential benefits in specific populations.
And in thinking about psychedelic research and who's included and excluded, why is it so important to focus on young people and youth?
Adolescence is a critical developmental stage where the brain undergoes significant changes. It's also a period that often coincides with the onset of many psychiatric disorders, and also a time period that often involves drug experimentation, especially in many Western countries. And since psychedelic drug use among adolescents seems to be increasing in countries such as the US, it's important to understand how these substances affect young people so we can inform public health policies and clinical practices.
How can twin modeling studies help us understand this risk in youth?
Twin modeling studies can be particularly important when it's not ethically feasible to enroll a potentially vulnerable population in a clinical trial. So, for example, underage individuals have not yet been included in modern-day psychedelic trials, and many ethics boards today would probably not allow researchers to administer psychedelics in this population simply because we don't know enough about risks. One way to better understand risks for this population is to conduct epidemiological studies on minors who choose to take psychedelics in the wild, so to speak. And one very nice epidemiological approach is to compare monozygotic twin pairs where one of the twins has used psychedelics and the other has not. Since they share 100% of their genes, differences between them in outcomes can be attributed more confidently to environmental factors such as psychedelic drug use, for example.
So to do this twin modeling, let's discuss the sample that you used in the research. Can you tell us about the child-adolescent twin study in Sweden, CATS, and how you used it to identify those eligible for the study and what data you used from this sample?
Yeah, sure. So the child and adolescent twin study in Sweden is a large twin study targeting all twins born in Sweden since July 1st, 1992. The aim of the study is to investigate how both genetic and environmental effects influence health and behavior in children and adolescents. And so we used data from this study and basically included all twins who had completed questions related to past use of psilocybin or LSD.
And as you just said, you're focusing on LSD and psilocybin, two of the more common drugs in this category. And as you also allude to, we know that youth may choose to use other substances that could have effects that are similar. So how did you account for other drug use apart from LSD and psilocybin?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it is indeed true that adolescents may use other drugs, of course. And in fact, in this study, the vast majority of twins who reported psychedelic use also reported other types of drug use. And so, to control for other types of drug use and enable us to get a better sense of the specific association of psychedelic use, we included different types of drug use as covariates in our models.
That makes sense. That's a good way to control for it. And to focus on what you're measuring, in the paper you outline you're going to measure psychotic symptoms and manic symptoms, as well as genetic risk. Can you review how are you quantifying and measuring those? So psychotic symptoms, manic symptoms, and genetic risk.
So psychotic and manic symptoms were assessed using standardized questionnaires. Psychotic symptoms were assessed with a 7-item questionnaire that broadly corresponded with Adolescent Psychotic-like symptom screener, while manic symptoms were assessed using a brief 10-item version of the Child Mania Rating Scale. And for genetic risk, we employed polygenic risk scores for schizophrenia and bipolar 1 disorder, which are essentially estimates of genetic risk for these disorders.
Now that we understand why you're doing the study, we understand the twin approach, the sample you have, the data, how many twins were in the final sample, or what were you actually working with now that you've set us up to almost talk about the results?
Yeah, so our final sample included 16,255 adolescent twins who provided self-reported data on psychedelic use. There were slightly more females, about 55%, than males, and more than 90% of participants provided self-reported data on psychotic or manic symptoms. In addition, a subset of these participants also provided genotype data, enriching the analysis with a genetic perspective.
In terms of how many adolescents reported actually using psychedelics and how many twin pairs were actually useful for this specific analysis because of that?
In this sample, 541 participants reported past psychedelic use, which was approximately 3% of the total sample included in the study. We had thousands of twin pairs, but only 144 monozygotic twins reported past use of psychedelics, and there were only 119 monozygotic twin pairs where one twin had tried psychedelics and the other had not.
With that specific sample of the ones there, you looked at the association between psychedelic use and self-reported psychotic and manic symptoms, and you actually built a regression model, which is very exciting. Can you review what are these big results that you found for that analysis?
Of course, I'll be happy to. So in unadjusted analyses, psychedelic use was associated with more self-reported psychotic and manic symptoms. But when we controlled for other types of drug use, this association was reversed, meaning that psychedelic use was associated with fewer self-reported psychotic and manic symptoms. What's more interesting, though, is that we also built regression models to investigate the interactions between psychedelic use and genetic vulnerability to schizophrenia or bipolar 1 disorder on self-reported psychotic and manic symptoms. And while there were no significant interactions on self-reported psychotic symptoms, all of our interaction models on self-reported manic symptoms were significant and showed that in individuals with higher genetic vulnerability to schizophrenia or bipolar 1 disorder, psychedelic use was associated with more manic symptoms than in individuals with lower genetic vulnerability.
What did you find for the twin pairs?
Well, interestingly, we found that after controlling for other types of drug use, self-reported psychotic symptoms were actually less common in monozygotic twins who had used psychedelics than in their co-twins who had not used psychedelics.
Based on your results, the finding that adjusting for substance-specific and substance-aggregated drug use, psychedelic use was associated with lower psychotic symptoms. So this doesn't mean that these drugs are safe or useful, but what do your findings mean?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that the co-twin control analyses were conducted on the 100 or so monozygotic twin pairs that were discordant on psychedelic use. The finding that psychedelic use was associated with fewer psychotic symptoms might suggest that psychedelic use led to a relative decrease in psychotic symptoms in the subset of monozygotic twins who had tried psychedelics while their co-twin had not. Having said that, it could also mean that the twins in this analysis who had more psychotic symptoms in the first place may have avoided psychedelics. Because of the research design, we just can't establish causality, but the finding that psychedelic use was associated with fewer psychotic symptoms does warrant further investigation.
You are very clear in the paper. You say this is cross-sectional. We are not establishing causality. But what do you think are those main takeaways that clinicians listening to the podcast should know about psychedelics in youth?
I think while we should be cautious in our interpretation of the results, the main takeaway for clinicians, in my opinion, is the tentative support this study provides for the idea that psychedelics may be contraindicated in people with genetic vulnerability to schizophrenia or bipolar 1 disorder, which is something researchers have been concerned about for a while.
As you and I know, and our listeners too, research in psychedelics is a very active area right now. What would you want drug developers or people running clinical studies on psychedelics to know about these results and how you would want them to use them?
Well, I think we are in a race against time. Legalization or decriminalization of psychedelic drugs is happening right now in many parts of the world, and yet we have a very limited understanding for whom and under what circumstances these substances may have unwanted effects. So this is something that should concern not only drug developers and researchers, but also policymakers. And I think we really need to make sure to get a better understanding of the risks associated with psychedelic drug use, which is something that we've started with this study.
Thank you to our guest, Dr. Simonsson, and thank you for tuning in. This episode was produced by Daniel Musisi at JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. Thanks for listening.